The old exchange had witnessed revolutions, hurricanes, and whispered betrayals that never made it into history books. Tonight it held its breath for a different kind of storm. Crystal chandeliers trembled faintly above a sea of tailored tuxedos and silk gowns. The Harbor Heritage Gala was the kind of event where legacies were not just celebrated, they were negotiated. Every glass of champagne carried a future. Every smile concealed a calculation. At the center of it all stood Graham Alden, white American, 42, CEO of Alden Maritime and Infrastructure, the man who could redraw the coastline of a city with a signature. His voice moved through the ballroom like a polished blade, calm, controlled, the kind of warmth that never quite reached the surface. Integrity, he was saying, one hand resting lightly on the podium, is not a word we put in our annual report. It is the architecture that holds everything else upright. Applause rose, obedient, admiring, inevitable. Behind him, the massive LED screen glowed with the Alden crest, gold against black, a dynasty rendered in pixels. In the front row, Blair Kessler watched him with the serene confidence of someone who believed the night had already been written in her favor. Chief of Staff, gatekeeper, the woman who had mastered the quiet art of standing one step behind power while controlling its pulse. She wore crimson, not loud, not desperate, the shade of certainty. To her left sat board members. To her right, a columnist from the Wall Street Journal who had already drafted tomorrow's headline. Everything was aligned. Everything was perfect, which was why no one noticed the woman at the back of the room. Simone Hart did not enter like a disruption. She entered like truth, inevitable and unhurried. Black American, 36, forensic compliance consultant. The woman corporations hired when their numbers stopped making sense and their ethics became negotiable. Her dress was not designed to compete with the room. It was ivory, structured, precise, the kind of elegance that did not ask to be seen because it already knew it would be. In her left hand was a slim black folder. In her right, nothing. She moved past conversations that paused half a second too long, past waiters who turned instinctively toward her, as if recognizing a gravity they could not name. At the podium, Graham's speech reached its closing cadence. Tonight, he said, the faintest shift in his tone signaling the approach of something personal. We also look toward the future, toward the next chapter of Alden Maritime. The screen behind him flickered. A small, almost delicate interruption. Most people assumed it was part of the program. Blair did not. Her spine straightened. Her smile did not move. Simone had reached the AV console. She didn't ask for permission. She didn't create a scene. She simply placed the black folder beside the technician's hand and said, softly enough that only he could hear, "Play the file marked Signature Comparison, Alden." There was something in her voice, not urgency, not fear, that made compliance feel like the only logical response. On stage, Graham paused. The Alden crest dissolved into white, then into a document. Two signatures appeared side by side. One bold, familiar, used to move billions. The other, almost identical. Almost. A murmur moved through the ballroom. Not yet understanding, but already sensing the shift. Simone stepped forward then, not toward the stage, but into the open space where the light could find her. For a moment, Graham's gaze met hers. Recognition did not come like a memory. It came like impact. 8 months collapsed into a single heartbeat. The night in Charleston, the quiet morning that followed, the email he never answered, the absence he had convinced himself was mutual. And then his eyes moved, helplessly, to the screen again. To the title now visible at the top of the document, Prenatal Termination Authorization. Alden. The room stopped pretending to breathe. Simone did not raise her voice. She didn't need to. Before the future is announced, she said, each word placed with surgical grace, the past deserves to be accurate. The sentence did not accuse. It recorded. Blair was on her feet now, her composure cracking, not in expression, but in the sudden stillness of her hands. The board members were leaning forward. Phones were no longer discreet. Graham's fingers tightened around the edge of the podium. the architecture of his control revealing its first fracture. And in the far corners of the ballroom, in Charleston, in New York, in Chicago, in living rooms and late-night kitchens where this story would travel, people leaned closer to their screens without realizing they were doing it. Because something rare was happening. Not a scandal, not a confrontation, a truth, walking into a room full of witnesses. If you're watching this moment unfold from somewhere in the world, if you can feel the shift in the air, the way a single choice can rewrite an entire life, tell me where you're listening from. I read every city, every country, every story. And if you believe in nights where silence breaks and the truth finally stands up in the light, stay with me until the end. And make sure you follow this journey, because this is only the first heartbeat of what's coming. On stage, Graham finally spoke her name, not into the microphone, just into the distance between them. Simone. And the way he said it, like a confession he had never intended to make in public, was the second thing that changed the night. The first had been the screen. The second was the realization that this was no longer his event. The light had already chosen its subject, and this time, it wasn't him. 8 months earlier, Charleston had been all light. Not the loud, restless brightness of cities that never sleep, but a warm, deliberate glow that moved across the harbor like a promise kept. The water carried the reflections of old facades and passing boats, turning history into something fluid, something almost forgiving. Simone had a 3-day compliance symposium hosted in a renovated customs house overlooking the docks, the kind of place where the past had been polished just enough to be profitable. By day, she spoke about forensic transparency to rooms full of executives who nodded as if ethics were a language they'd always known. She wore charcoal suits, her hair pulled into a clean twist, her voice measured and precise. She was the woman people called when something had already gone wrong. By night, she walked the waterfront alone, not because she was lonely, because solitude for her had never been an absence. It was a form of control. The evening she met Graham Alden, the air carried the soft salt of the Atlantic and the distant sound of a saxophone drifting from somewhere behind the restaurants on East Bay Street. She noticed him first by the way people adjusted around him. Not out of fear, not exactly, but because his presence reorganized the space without effort. Conversations lowered half a tone. Waiters moved faster. Doors opened before he reached them. White American, tall in the way that suggested a lifetime of being listened to. His suit was midnight blue, his tie loosened as if the day had been long but successfully conquered. He was standing alone near the railing, looking not at the skyline, but at the dark water beyond it, as though there were something there only he could see. Simone would have walked past him. She had walked past men like him her entire career. Men whose signatures shaped markets, whose schedules were curated by other people's ambitions. But he turned slightly, just enough for their eyes to meet. And in that single glance, there was no recognition, no calculation, just curiosity. "You're the forensic auditor from the afternoon panel," he said, his voice lower than she expected, touched with a restraint that felt almost careful. "You're the CEO everyone was pretending not to stare at," she replied. For a moment, something like surprise crossed his face. Quick, unguarded, gone before it could become a habit. "Graham Alden," he said, offering his hand. Simone Hart. His handshake was warm, not the performative grip of a man accustomed to negotiations, but something steadier, as though he had decided, in that instant, not to treat her like a transaction. They talked, not about acquisitions or regulatory loopholes or the silent wars of corporate governance. They talked about the harbor, about how Charleston carried its past in layers, the way certain buildings leaned toward the water as if listening for ships that would never return. He told her he had grown up on the coast of Maine, in a house that faced storms head-on. She told him she had learned early that stability was something you built, not something you inherited. And somewhere between the second glass of wine and the moment the saxophone shifted into a slower melody, the air changed. It wasn't sudden. It was recognition, the quiet, disarming kind. He listened when she spoke, not in the strategic way powerful men often did, storing information for later use, but as if her thoughts were something he wanted to understand for their own sake. And she, who had built her life on reading motives and tracing the hidden architecture of people's decisions, found nothing to decode. That was the first illusion. The second was the way he looked at her when they walked back toward the hotel. Not at her body, though desire was there. Unmistakable. Honest. At her face, as if every expression mattered. The suite he had booked for the conference speakers overlooked the water. Its windows opened just enough to let in the night air. Simone should have said goodnight at the door. She knew that. She had lived long enough to understand the mathematics of power, how proximity could become leverage, how a single moment could be rewritten later into something else. But he didn't reach for her immediately. He stepped back, giving her space to enter first, as though the choice had to be hers. Inside, the room was quiet. The city's light moved across the ceiling in slow, shifting patterns, like reflections at the bottom of a pool. "You don't trust easily," he said, not as an accusation, but as an observation. "No," she answered. "Good," he replied. "You shouldn't." There was something in the way he said it, a respect for her distance, for the boundaries she had carved out of necessity, that made her feel for the first time in years, not evaluated, but seen. When he kissed her, it was without urgency. No conquest, no performance, just a warmth that spread slowly, deliberately, as though he understood that for her, safety was the rarest currency. Later, lying beside him with the curtains open to the dark harbor, she listened to his breathing even out into sleep. He had one arm draped loosely over her waist, not holding her in place, simply resting there, a contact that felt unclaimed. She watched the faint movement of light across his face and allowed herself, briefly, dangerously, to imagine what it would be like to wake up to the same morning more than once. That was the most perfect illusion of all, because in that room, with the sound of the water below and the city wrapped in its patient glow, Graham Alden was not an empire. He was a man who had asked her what she feared and had listened to the answer. And Simone Hart, who had spent her life building structures that could not collapse, allowed herself to believe, just for that night, that she had found something that did not need to be analyzed, verified, or protected. Something that was simply safe. In the morning, the harbor was soaked. He was already awake, standing by the window, the first light outlining the sharp architecture of his shoulders. For a moment, she watched him without moving, memorizing the way the world looked when it had not yet become complicated. He turned, and the expression that crossed his face when he saw her, open, unguarded, almost relieved, sealed the illusion in place. "We'll talk today," he said, crossing the room, brushing a strand of hair away from her cheek, with a gentleness that felt like a promise. She believed him, not because she was naive, but because everything about that night had been consistent with the truth she had learned to trust. That real power did not need to rush, did not need to deceive, did not need to hide. Outside, the city moved into its day. Inside, Simone gathered her things, her movements efficient, composed. The same woman who had arrived in Charleston with her life precisely structured. Except that now there was something new, something fragile and luminous, resting quietly beneath her control. She did not know yet how carefully it would have to be dismantled. Only that for one night, in a room filled with harbor light and unspoken possibility, she had stepped into a version of her life where safety had not been an illusion. And that memory would become the standard by which she measured everything that followed. In Simone's world, nothing ever collapsed all at once. It shifted, a decimal out of place, a date that didn't align, a signature that carried the right shape but the wrong rhythm. Truth announced itself in the language of almost. The morning after Charleston, the harbor still lived inside her. That quiet silver light, the warmth of a man who had not tried to own the moment, only to share it. Graham had kissed her once before she left the suite, not like a conclusion, but like a continuation. "We'll talk today," he had said again, his hand resting briefly at the small of her back as they stepped into the elevator. She had nodded, composed, already recalibrating her mind into the clean geometry of her profession. Simone Hart did not build her life on maybes. By the time she reached the airport, her phone had returned to its normal rhythm. Messages from clients, an update from a legal team in Chicago, a calendar alert for a deposition. There was no message from Graham. Not yet. She told herself it was timing. He was a man whose hours belonged to boardrooms and markets that opened in different time zones. She had seen the way people orbited him, the way access to him had to be negotiated through layers. Still, when her plane lifted into the pale blue above the coast, she checked her phone again. Nothing. It was not disappointment she felt. It was a notation, a small mark in the margin of an otherwise clean page. By late afternoon, the first email arrived. From him. Subject line, "Good to meet you." 2 sentences. Back-to-back meetings. "We'll connect soon." Polite, precise, written in the neutral tone of a man accustomed to documentation. She read it twice, not for meaning, but for absence. The warmth from the night before had been edited out. Almost the same, but not. Over the next 2 days, the pattern continued. Her work moved forward with its usual exactness. A forensic review for a nonprofit foundation in Baltimore, a conference call with a regulatory team in D.C., and in between, small things that didn't belong. A calendar invite appeared for a medical consultation she had never scheduled. Women's Health, Charleston. She stared at it for a long time before opening the details. The appointment had been canceled. Canceled by a contact number she did not recognize. Simone did not panic. Panic was an emotional response. She investigated. The clinic confirmed the cancellation with professional efficiency. "Yes, Ms. Hart. It was done by your partner's office. They said you were unavailable." "My partner?" Simone asked, her voice calm enough to make the receptionist hesitate. "The Alden corporate liaison." The line went quiet for a fraction of a second too long, almost imperceptible. After she hung up, Simone placed her phone face down on her desk and looked out at the city beyond her office windows. Washington moved below her in its usual order. Traffic flowing in regulated lines, people crossing at designated intervals. Control, structure. She thought of Graham standing by the hotel window, the morning light outlining his profile, the way he had said her name as if it were not a variable, but a certainty. Almost. The next message from him came that evening. "Traveling. Back Friday." No question. No reference to the clinic. No acknowledgement of the shift in tone. It was the kind of communication that moved billions of dollars without revealing a single intention. And it did not match the man who had listened to her talk about structural integrity as if it were poetry. Simone opened her laptop. Not to search for him. She never searched for people. She searched for systems. Alden Maritime and Infrastructure appeared in clean, public data. Acquisitions, expansions, philanthropic partnerships. And in every photograph from the past 2 days, Graham stood beside the same woman. Blonde, composed, red suits tailored to the line of authority. Blair Kessler, chief of staff. Her proximity was consistent. Her hand occasionally rested on his arm, not in intimacy, but in access. The kind of touch that signaled ownership of a schedule, of information, of movement. Simone watched a video from a press conference in Savannah. Graham speaking about infrastructure reform. Blair leaning in to hand him a document at precisely the moment his speech required it. Their choreography was flawless. Too flawless. In Simone's work, perfection was never a sign of harmony. It was a sign of control. Later that night, she stood in her kitchen with a glass of water she had not drunk. Her reflection in the dark window looked exactly as it always had. Contained, intelligent, unshaken. Nothing in her life had changed. And yet there was a second silence now, one that moved beneath the first. The silence of a question she had not asked. She returned to her desk and opened the email again. "We'll connect soon." The language of delay. The language of someone whose access was being filtered, or whose voice had been adjusted. Her phone vibrated once more. Not from him. An automated message from a private number. All future correspondence regarding Mr. Alden should be directed through the executive office. No signature, no name, just structure, just removal. Simone leaned back in her chair and closed her eyes. In her field, when something didn't belong, you didn't force it into place. You marked it. You waited. You watched for the next deviation, because the first anomaly was never the evidence. It was the invitation. Across the country, in photographs and interviews, Graham Alden continued to look exactly as he had that night in Charleston. Controlled, articulate, a man whose world moved in precise alignment. Only now there was a distance in his expression, a faint tightening around the mouth, as if something unscripted had been edited out. Simone did not call him. She did not send another message. She did not need to, because the illusion had not shattered. Not yet. It had simply developed a flaw, a hairline fracture in glass that still held its shape, still reflected the light exactly as before, but would, under pressure, reveal the entire structure beneath it. And Simone Hart had built her life on recognizing the moment when an almost became a pattern. The moment when something small and out of place stopped being an accident and started being a design. That moment was approaching. She could feel it the way she felt the shift in numbers before a system failed. Quiet, precise, unavoidable. The package arrived on a Thursday afternoon, wrapped in the kind of brown paper that suggested anonymity rather than care. Simone almost didn't open it. She had just finished a deposition that lasted 6 hours and dismantled a nonprofit board member's career with nothing more than timestamps and calm questions. Her mind was still moving in straight, disciplined lines. Evidence, motive, conclusion. The return address was the Charleston Hotel. Inside was a note printed on heavy cardstock, recovered from the suite safe, registered under your name. We apologize for the delay. There was no apology in the weight of the envelope, only inevitability. Simone stood in the quiet of her apartment, the late afternoon light falling across the dining table in long, patient rectangles. For a moment, she didn't touch the contents. She simply looked at them, sensing the way a single object could alter the architecture of everything she thought she understood. When she finally opened the envelope, a slim black phone slid into her palm. Not hers. She knew that instantly. Her phone was in her handbag, its case a muted matte, its edges softened by use. This one was pristine, cold, expensive in the way that didn't need to announce itself. A second phone. She didn't power it on immediately. In Simone's world, you didn't rush into evidence. You observed it. You allowed it to reveal its own logic. It was the same model Graham used. She remembered the weight of it in his hand the night in Charleston, the way he had set it face down on the bedside table as if he had nothing to hide. Almost nothing. Her thumb hovered over the screen. She could have called the hotel and returned it. That would have been the appropriate action for the woman she had been her entire life. The woman who separated her personal existence from her professional methods with clean, unbreakable lines. Instead, she pressed the power button. The screen came alive with a quiet glow. No passcode. That was the first anomaly. A man like Graham Alden did not leave devices unsecured. The second anomaly was the notification waiting at the top. Not a message, not a missed call. A document. Prenatal termination authorization. Draft. Simone didn't breathe. The title existed in the neutral language of medicine and law. The kind of phrasing designed to make irreversible decisions sound procedural. Her reflection hovered faintly in the glass as she opened the file. The document filled the screen. Patient name, Hart, Simone. Estimated term, clinical notes, authorization for termination. And at the bottom, a signature, Graham Alden. For a moment, the room lost its dimensions. The table beneath her hand, the window, the city beyond it, everything receded into a distant geometry that had nothing to do with her body, her life, the quiet, luminous night in Charleston. She read it again, not as a woman, as a forensic specialist. The signature was correct. The letters carried the same confident slant she had seen on corporate agreements, the same decisive pressure on the final stroke. And yet, something in it resisted. It was a rhythm she couldn't name immediately, a microscopic hesitation in the curve of the a compression in the spacing that felt careful, too careful. Simone set the phone down on the table with deliberate precision and walked to the window. Outside, the city continued in its indifferent motion. Traffic lights changing, people crossing streets. The ordinary choreography of lives untouched by this moment. She pressed her palm against the glass, grounding herself in the cool surface. In Charleston, Graham had listened to her speak about structural truth as if it were a language he had always wanted to learn. He had said her name as though it carried weight. He had woken before her and stood at the window, watching the harbor like a man who understood patience. That man did not authorize documents in secret. That man did not reduce a life, their life, to a draft in a hidden phone. Unless, Simone closed her eyes. Her work had taught her a single, unbreakable principle. Evidence did not exist to confirm what you feared. It existed to reveal what was real. She returned to the table and lifted the phone again. The metadata was intact. Creation date, edit history, user credentials. Each layer opened like a door in a long, silent corridor. The file had not originated from Graham's primary account. It had been transferred, modified, resaved. The last editor's ID was not his. It was an executive access code, one that appeared repeatedly in Alden Maritime's internal filings. Kessler B. Simone stared at the screen until the letters stopped being letters and became a pattern. The almost from the canceled clinic appointment. The email filtered through an executive office. The public images where Blair stood one step closer than necessary. Access, control, authorization. The illusion did not shatter. It realigned. Graham had not removed himself from her. He had been removed. And someone had prepared a document designed to erase what had begun in that quiet hotel suite before it could become visible. Simone lowered herself into the chair. Her hand moved instinctively to her abdomen. The gesture so new she didn't yet recognize it as habit. 8 weeks. The doctor in D.C. had confirmed it that morning. A life not yet visible to the world. A life already recorded in a file that had never been meant for her eyes. The second phone lay on the table like an object pulled from the future. A small, perfect device that had traveled to chance, negligence, or design to arrive in her hands. A fate object, not because it answered anything, but because it changed the question. This was no longer about whether Graham Alden had chosen silence. It was about who had been speaking in his name. Simone reached for her laptop, not to write to him, not yet. Communication was a reaction, and she did not react. She built cases. The document on the phone glowed softly in the fading light, its language still clinical, still procedural. A draft, a decision waiting to be made real. Simone opened a new file and began to map the data. Timestamps, user, IDS, transfer logs. The same calm, meticulous process she used when dismantling empires that believed their structures were invisible. Only now the stakes were not financial. They were personal in a way that did not weaken her focus. It refined it. In the reflection of the darkening window, she saw herself as she had always been, composed, exact, a woman who did not confuse emotion with evidence. And on the table, between her and the night, lay the second phone, the small, silent object that had shifted the axis of her life without a single spoken word. It did not accuse. It did not explain. It simply existed. And in Simone Hart's world, existence was the first step toward truth. In Simone's profession, a name was never just a name. It was an access point, a key to calendars, permissions, decision chains, to the invisible architecture that determined who could move freely through a system and who could not. Kessler B. The user ID from the document did not feel like a person yet. It was a pattern, a repetition across logs and edits in transfer histories, a signature without handwriting. Simone began where she always began. Not with curiosity, but with structure. Alden Maritime and Infrastructure was a public company. Its executive hierarchy was not a secret. Annual reports listed officers, their titles, their committees. Photographs accompanied press releases, panels, charitable events. She opened a browser and typed the name she had already seen beneath Graham's image in Savannah. Blair Kessler, Chief of Staff. The first photograph that appeared was from a maritime infrastructure summit in Rotterdam. Graham at the center of the stage, speaking about coastal resilience. Blair one step behind him, angled slightly toward his shoulder, holding a folder that looked identical to the one he now carried in every public appearance. Blonde, controlled, A face designed not for warmth but for clarity. Sharp cheekbones, eyes that never appeared fully surprised. Simone watched the video. Graham paused mid-sentence, and Blair moved forward without looking at him, placing a document into his hand at precisely the moment he needed it. Not assistance, synchronization. The next image was from a charity foundation in Boston. Blair's hand rested lightly at the inside of Graham's elbow as she guided him toward a donor. Not intimate, directional, ownership of movement. Simone clicked through a sequence of events: New York, Savannah, London. In every frame, Blair existed at the same distance from him. Not close enough to be questioned. Not far enough to be irrelevant. Control in its most refined form. Simone leaned back in her chair and let the pattern settle. In Charleston, Blair had appeared only once. A fleeting moment in the hotel lobby as Simone was leaving the conference hall. A woman in a tailored red suit speaking quietly into a phone. Her eyes scanning the room, not for conversation, but for variables. At the time, Simone had registered her the way she registered everything, a detail without immediate relevance. Now the memory shifted, recontextualized. In Simone's field, confirmation never came from a single source. It came from convergence. She opened the metadata from the document again. Every edit carried a timestamp that aligned with Graham's public appearances. Moments when he was on stage, in interviews, in transit. Moments when his primary device would have been in use. The draft had been modified during those windows. By the executive access code, by Blair, Simone moved to the next layer. Internal communication protocols. Chiefs of staff did not merely manage schedules. They controlled the flow of information. Every message passed through them. Every meeting was filtered by them. Every private contact could be redirected without the principal ever seeing the original request. The email she had received. All future correspondence regarding Mr. Alden should be directed through the executive office. Had not been an administrative courtesy. It had been a firewall. Simone opened the clinic's cancellation record. The contact number that had authorized it matched Alden Maritime's executive office. Not Graham's personal line, not his assistant, the executive office. She closed the file and walked into the kitchen, needing distance from the screen, from the clean logic that was assembling itself into a narrative she had not yet allowed herself to feel. The city outside her apartment had moved into evening. Lights appeared in other people's windows. Domestic, ordinary, lives unfolding without the intervention of forensic reconstruction. She poured a glass of water and did not drink it, because this part was no longer about systems. It was about intention. Blair Kessler had not acted in isolation. Her position did not allow for random decisions. She had access to medical information that should never have been routed through corporate channels. She had created a draft authorization. She had canceled a consultation. She had redirected communication. Each action was small, procedural, individually defensible. Together, they formed a design. Simone returned to her desk and opened a different set of records. Philanthropic partnerships. Alden Maritime's largest recent initiative was a maternal health foundation in partnership with a private hospital network. Blair sat on the oversight committee. Medical data, administrative authority, public narrative. The convergence was exact. And then Simone found the interview. A lifestyle publication, the kind that featured powerful women in curated environments. Blair in a glass-walled office, the harbor behind her. "I believe in protecting vision," she was saying, her voice calm, her posture immaculate. "Graham is the future of this industry. My role is to make sure nothing compromises that." Nothing. The word remained on the screen long after the video ended. Simone watched it again. Not for the content, for the tone. There was no affection in Blair's voice when she spoke Graham's name. There was possession, not of the man, of the structure around him. In Simone's world, that distinction mattered because love was unpredictable, control was not. Simone closed the laptop and sat very still. She allowed the truth to settle in the only place that mattered, not in her mind, which had already assembled it, but in her body, where the quiet knowledge of the life growing inside her had begun to change the way she moved through the day. Blair Kessler was not a rival, not a mistress, not even, in the traditional sense, an enemy. She was a system, a gate, a mechanism designed to regulate access to Graham Alden and to the future attached to his name. And Simone, with her unplanned presence, her unfiltered connection, her unapproved existence, had become a variable. Variables were eliminated, not emotionally, procedurally. That was the most chilling part. Simone reached for the second phone again and looked at the document one more time. The draft that had never been meant for her. The signature that carried the shape of the man she had trusted and the rhythm of someone else's hand. Her name at the top, clinical, impersonal, as if her life could be reduced to a file. She placed the phone back on the table and rested her palm over her abdomen. The gesture no longer tentative. There was a steadiness in her now that had not existed in Charleston. Not the illusion of safety. Something stronger, recognition. In her career, confirmation always brought the same moment of clarity. The instant when a suspicion became a fact and the emotional noise fell away, replaced by a clean, almost serene focus. She knew who Blair Kessler was. Not as a photograph, not as a title, but as a function, as the person who had stood between her and Graham without ever appearing to move. As the author of a decision written in someone else's name, as the designer of a future in which Simone Hart did not exist. The illusion of Charleston did not vanish. It remained where it had always been, a real night, a real connection, a truth that had not been erased, only interrupted. But now it had a counterpart, a second reality, one in which every path leading back to him had been quietly sealed. Simone did not feel rage. Rage was imprecise. She felt alignment. The same alignment she experienced when a complex case finally resolved into a single, undeniable conclusion. Her name is Blair, and the system had revealed its architect. The next step would not be emotional. It would be structural. The email arrived at 6:12 a.m., precisely time for the hour when the mind was most vulnerable to interruption. Not fully awake, not fully armored. Subject line, confidential, professional courtesy. Simone read it once without opening the attachment. The sender was a law firm she recognized, not for its victories, but for the kind of clients it represented. Corporations that did not litigate to win. Corporations that litigated to exhaust. She rose from bed, wrapped a robe around herself, and walked to the kitchen before she allowed herself to read further. Routine first, structure first, coffee measured in exact scoops, water brought to the precise temperature. Only then did she open the message. The language was flawless. It acknowledged her recent professional interactions with Alden Maritime. It referenced her reputation for discretion. It expressed a desire to avoid unnecessary public complications for all parties involved. And then, in a paragraph that appeared almost gentle in its construction, it introduced the term, a non-disclosure agreement, a reputational risk assessment, a clause regarding the preservation of executive legacy in matters that could be misinterpreted by external observers. Simone did not need to reach the end to understand what it was. Not a demand, an enclosure. The attachment opened into 40 pages of immaculate legal architecture. If she signed, she would receive a consulting contract, long-term, lucrative, exclusive. Her firm would be retained as Alden Maritime's primary forensic compliance partner for the next 5 years. Her work would triple. Her visibility would expand. Her independence would vanish. In exchange, she would agree to no direct communication with Graham Alden, no public or private disclosure of any personal interaction, no claim, implied or explicit, that could be construed as affecting the company's governance or succession structure. The language did not mention pregnancy. It did not need to. The final clause was almost beautiful in its precision. The undersigned acknowledges that any narrative contrary to the established executive record may be subject to corrective action through appropriate legal channels. Corrective action. Simone closed the document and stood very still in the center of her kitchen. Outside, the city was just beginning to move. Early traffic. A jogger passing beneath her window. A dog pulling its owner toward the morning. Everything ordinary, everything intact. Her phone vibrated again. A second email, not from the law firm, from a private address. I thought it would be more respectful if we spoke in person. No signature, only a location and a time. Charleston. The same hotel. Simone did not hesitate. By noon, she was on a flight. Not because she felt summoned, because she refused to let the terms of the conversation be defined without her presence. Charleston greeted her with the same warm air, the same light over the harbor. But now the city felt curated, as though it had been arranged for a different kind of meeting. The hotel lobby had not changed. Polished marble, muted conversations, the scent of white tea and citrus. Blair Kessler was waiting in the lounge, seated at a table that allowed her to see both the entrance and the elevators. Positioning. She wore cream this time, the color of neutrality, of someone who intended to appear reasonable. When Simone approached, Blair stood, not in greeting, in acknowledgement. "Dr. Hart," she said, her voice carrying the faintest trace of warmth, like a memory of something that had never actually existed. "Thank you for coming." Simone sat without removing her coat. "I prefer clarity," she replied. "Of course you do," Blair said, smiling slightly. "It's why we respect your work." A server appeared as if summoned by an invisible signal. Simone declined everything. Blair ordered tea. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was evaluative. Blair studied her the way one reviewed a file, assessing risk, identifying leverage. "You've built a remarkable career," Blair began. "Independent, uncompromised. That's rare." Simone did not respond. Praise, in negotiations, was not a compliment. It was an opening position. "The contract is generous," Blair continued. "It recognizes your value. It protects your future." "And whose future does it erase?" Simone asked. Blair's smile did not change. "No one is being erased," she said softly. "We are aligning realities." She placed a slim folder on the table between them, not pushed forward, simply present. "Graham's life operates on a scale that requires coherence," Blair went on. "Markets, boards, international partners, they depend on stability, on a narrative that cannot be disrupted by personal variables." Variables. The words settled in the air like a diagnosis. "You're a rational woman," Blair said. "You understand that certain connections, however meaningful in the moment, cannot be allowed to create structural risk." Simone's gaze did not move. "And if I decline?" she asked. Blair lifted her cup of tea and took a measured sip. "Then we proceed differently," she said. The tone did not change. That was what made it a threat. Not volume, not aggression, procedure. "The clinic will amend its records," Blair continued. "There will be questions about how your name appeared in a confidential file, about why a consultant with your expertise accessed executive medical data without authorization." A pause. "Your current clients will be informed of the investigation. Temporarily, of course. These things take time." Time. The currency of exhaustion. "And," Blair added gently, "in matters involving maternal fitness, public perception is delicate. Courts tend to favor stability." For the first time, her eyes moved to Simone's abdomen. Not openly, just a flicker. "A notation. You would still have your career," Blair concluded, "but it would be smaller, contained, and your personal life would become complicated." The threat did not mention loss. It described reduction. Simone looked at the woman across from her and saw, not an enemy, but a system speaking through a human voice. "Legal, measured, unassailable. You're asking me to disappear," Simone said. "I'm offering you permanence," Blair replied. The distinction was almost poetic. Outside the windows, the harbor moved with its patient, indifferent rhythm. The same water that had reflected the illusion of safety 8 months ago now carried a different light, sharper, more exact. Simone felt the first fracture then, not in her control, in the illusion that this could be resolved through understanding. Because this was not about misunderstanding. It was about design. The life growing inside her shifted. A small, almost imperceptible movement that grounded her more completely than any argument could have. Blair watched her, waiting for the calculation, for the moment when pragmatism would override whatever remained of that night in Charleston. "Take a day," Blair said finally, sliding the folder a fraction closer. "You don't have to answer now." Simone rose. The chair moved back with a quiet, definitive sound. "I already have," she said. Blair did not stand. "Then you understand the consequences." Simone looked down at her. For the first time, the warmth in her voice was real. Not soft, not kind, clear. "Yes," she said. "I understand the structure." She left the folder on the table, left the tea untouched, left the hotel without looking back. Outside, the Charleston air felt different, not because it had changed, but because she had. The collapse did not come as tears. It came as the final removal of an illusion. There would be no private conversation with Graham, no spontaneous recognition, no simple return to the truth of that night. There was only a system that had identified her as a risk and moved, with flawless legality, to contain her. For a moment, standing at the edge of the harbor, Simone allowed herself to feel the weight of it, the contract she had not signed, the future that had been offered and withdrawn in the same breath. The realization that love, in this structure, was not an argument. It was a liability. The water moved below her, reflecting the late afternoon light in fractured gold. Collapse, in her world, did not mean destruction. It meant the point at which the original design could no longer hold. And as Simone Hart turned away from the harbor, the calm returned. Not the calm of safety, but the calm of a woman who had finally seen the full architecture of what stood against her. The threat had been legal, which meant it could be dismantled. Structurally, Charleston at dusk had a way of softening everything. The harbor turned to liquid bronze. The old facades along East Bay held the last warmth of the day, as if they had learned, over centuries, how to keep light even when the sky let go of it. Simone walked without choosing a direction. Past the restaurants where laughter spilled into the street. Past the wrought iron gates that guarded private courtyards full of quiet, cultivated beauty. Past the very corner where 8 months earlier she had stood beside Graham and believed, not in forever, but in the possibility of something uncalculated. Now every place carried a second version of itself, the visible one, unchanged. And the underlying structure, the contracts, the permissions, the access points that determine who could stand where and for how long. She reached the battery just as the sun slipped below the horizon. The water stretched out in front of her, calm in the way that only deep currents could be calm. The surface smooth, the movement beneath invisible. Simone lowered herself onto a bench facing the harbor, and for the first time since the meeting with Blair, she allowed her hands to rest, unoccupied, in her lap. The collapse had been precise. It had not raised its voice. It had not humiliated her. It had simply revealed the scale of the structure she was standing against. A corporation with international reach. A legal team trained to erase without appearing to touch. A woman whose power lay in her ability to move information like a surgeon moves a blade. Clean, exact, leaving no visible wound. Simone exhaled slowly. For a moment, a brief human moment, she imagined the other version of this story, the one where she signed the contract, where her career expanded in predictable, impressive lines, where the child she carried became a private detail in a life that appeared intact from every angle, where the night in Charleston remained a memory, sealed and harmless. It was not a small temptation. It was stability, the very thing she had built her life to achieve. A gull moved across the sky, its wings cutting through the fading light. Simone watched it until it disappeared. Then she placed her hand, almost unconsciously, over her abdomen. The gesture was no longer new. It had begun to anchor her. In her work, she had spent years reconstructing other people's choices, tracing the moment when they decided to alter a number, to sign a document, to move money where it did not belong. Every case had a point of origin, not the first crime, the first justification, the moment when they told themselves that survival required compromise. She had never allowed herself that moment, not once, because the foundation of everything she was, her reputation, her independence, the way people trusted her to enter the most compromised systems and leave them transparent, rested on a single, unspoken line. She did not negotiate with truth. And now, truth was no longer an abstract principle. It had a heartbeat. It had a future that existed only if she chose to defend it. The sky deepened into indigo. Lights appeared along the shoreline, one by one, like a quiet sequence of decisions. Simone closed her eyes, and for the first time since she opened the document on the second phone, she allowed herself to feel the full weight of what had been offered to her. Not just the contract, the erasure, the transformation of her life into something smaller, more manageable, more acceptable. The removal of her from Graham's world without ever having to confront the fact that she had been there. Tears did not come. Grief, for Simone, had never been an eruption. It was a narrowing, a focusing of everything she knew into a single, unavoidable conclusion. She opened her eyes and looked at the harbor again. The water had darkened, but it still held the last line of light at the horizon. A thin, unwavering brightness that refused to disappear even as night moved in. In Charleston, that first night, Graham had told her about the storms in Maine, how the sky would go black, he had said, and for a few minutes you'd think the world had ended. And then there'd be this break, just a strip of light, and you'd realize the storm wasn't the end of anything. It was just movement. She had listened then, without knowing she would one day need that memory. Now it returned to her with a clarity that felt almost like instruction. If she signed, the story would end in silence. Not a violent ending, a clean one. Approved, documented. If she refused, the system would move against her. Legally, publicly, exhaustively, her name would be questioned. Her work would be audited. Her clients would hesitate. Her life would become, in the language of corporate governance, a risk. Simone stood. The movement was not dramatic. It was the same controlled motion she used when rising from a conference table, when closing a case, when delivering a conclusion that would dismantle an entire structure. Only now it carried something else. Alignment. She turned toward the city, toward the streets where she had walked that first night, believing safety could exist without verification. That illusion had collapsed. What remained was choice, not between love and ambition, not between Graham and her career, between disappearance and light. She reached into her coat pocket and took out her phone. The contract was still open in her email. The cursor blinked at the bottom of the screen, waiting for her response. For a moment, she watched it. A small, mechanical pulse, a demand for decision. Then she began to type. Not an argument, not a refusal filled with explanation. A single sentence. I do not sign documents that rewrite reality. She sent it. The night did not change. No thunder, no visible shift in the city around her. But inside her, something settled into place with the finality of a foundation poured. She understood, with the same calm certainty she brought to every investigation, that what would follow would not be easy. The system would respond. It would question her. It would attempt to contain her. It would move with all its resources to restore its preferred narrative. And she would meet it, not as a woman trying to protect a private life, but as the architect of a truth that had been hidden behind layers of access and permission. Simone began to walk back toward the hotel where she would spend one last night in Charleston. The streets were lit now, the air cooler, the sound of the harbor steady behind her. The line formed in her mind not as a declaration to anyone else, but as the internal axis around which everything else would turn. If it ends in light. Not in a sealed file, not in a private agreement, not in a story adjusted to fit a boardroom. In light, where every signature could be seen, where every action carried its author, where the night in Charleston would no longer exist as an illusion, but as the beginning of something that had demanded, from the very first moment, to be real. She walked on, her pace even, her silhouette moving through the illuminated streets with the quiet inevitability of someone who had chosen her direction and would not be diverted. Behind her, the harbor held its line of brightness at the horizon. Ahead, the city opened into its ordered grid of light. And in the space between them, Simone Hart carried the calm, unbreakable knowledge that the story had shifted. No longer about what had been done to her, about what she would build in response. Simone did not leave Charleston the way people leave places that have broken them. There was no hurried flight booked at dawn, no last glance at the harbor, as if memory itself were dangerous. She checked out of the hotel at 11 in the morning, thanked the concierge by name, and asked for a car to the airport in the same calm tone she used when concluding a successful case. Disappearance, in her world, was never an act of retreat. It was a reallocation of visibility. By the time the plane lifted above the coastline, the city had already begun to release its hold on her. Not because it mattered less, but because it had given her what she needed: clarity. She did not return to Washington. That would have been predictable. Predictability was the first vulnerability Blair's system would test. Instead, Simone landed in Chicago under a different itinerary, one she had arranged months earlier for a conference she never intended to attend. The reservation existed in her calendar like a ghost of a future she had quietly repurposed. The hotel overlooked the river, all glass and quiet geometry, a place where no one asked questions because discretion was part of the architecture. Simone moved through the room once, not as a guest, but as an analyst. Sight lines, camera angles, network access points. Then she placed the second phone on the desk beside her laptop and began. Her work had always been about building chains, sequences of evidence so precise that they could not be broken without exposing the hand that tried to sever them. Now she built one for herself. The document from the phone was not copied. It was cloned, encrypted, hashed, stored in 3 separate locations that did not know about each other. Chain of custody began not in a courtroom, but in intention. The metadata was extracted and preserved with timestamps that would hold under legal scrutiny. Every edit, every transfer, every access point that led back to Kessler.B became a node in a map that existed nowhere except in Simone's control. She worked in silence, not the heavy silence of isolation, but the focused quiet she had always associated with truth and formation. In the afternoons, she met with a forensic document examiner whose name never appeared in public records. They sat across from each other in a private office that contained nothing personal. No photographs, no awards, only a desk and 2 chairs placed at an exact angle. He did not ask about the context. He examined the signature. "The baseline stroke is authentic," he said after an hour, his voice neutral. "But the pressure variation here and here indicates guided replication." "Not Graham Alden's hand," Simone said, "not without intervention." She nodded once. Another link in the chain. The next meeting was with an attorney who specialized in corporate governance conflicts. A woman in her 50s with silver hair and a reputation for dismantling executive boards that had believed themselves untouchable. They did not speak about emotion. They spoke about timing. "If this goes public," the attorney said, "it must do so in a context where suppression becomes impossible." "A room with witnesses," Simone replied. "A room where the narrative is already being broadcast," the attorney agreed. Simone thought of the Harbor Heritage Gala, the annual event where Alden Maritime presented its philanthropic initiatives, its future projects, its carefully constructed image of integrity, a stage designed for announcements, a system built for visibility. She did not smile, but something inside her aligned with the inevitability of it. In the evenings, she walked along the Chicago River, the cold air sharpening her focus, the reflections of the city rising and breaking in the dark water. Her hand rested against her abdomen more often now, not in uncertainty, but in recognition. The life she carried had begun to alter her sense of time, not urgency, precision. Every decision was measured against a future that had to exist in light. Graham did not contact her. The absence no longer registered as loss. It registered as confirmation. Blair's system was still intact, still filtering, still confident. Simone allowed it, because disappearance was not invisibility. It was preparation. She changed her routines. New phone, new email architecture, meetings arranged through channels that did not intersect with her professional identity. Her clients were told she was on a long-term investigation requiring complete confidentiality, a statement so consistent with her career that no one questioned it. In Washington, her office lights remained off. In Charleston, her name ceased to appear in hotel registries and conference attendance lists. In Alden Maritime's monitoring reports, she became a closed file. a variable that had removed itself, exactly as Blair intended. Except that Simone's absence was not the result of pressure. It was a strategic withdrawal, the kind used to gather force. One night, in the quiet of her hotel room, she opened a new document. Not evidence, not legal structure. A timeline, Charleston, the night of the conference. The clinic cancellation. The second phone. The meeting in the hotel lounge. The contract. Each event placed in sequence, not as memory, but as fact. At the bottom, she added a single future entry, Harbor Heritage Gala. Disclosure. She did not yet know the exact form it would take. Only that the room would be full. The cameras would be live. And the system that had relied on private containment would be forced into public acknowledgement. Simone closed the document and moved to the window. Chicago at night was a different kind of harbor. Not water and ships, but light and glass. Reflections stacked in vertical layers. She saw herself in the dark and pain, not the woman who had arrived in Charleston believing in a night that felt like safety, not the woman who had sat across from Blair and heard her future reduced to a clause. This version of herself was quieter, more exact, a woman who had stepped out of the narrative written for her and begun constructing her own. Her disappearance had created a vacuum in the system that had tried to define her. A silence that would make her return impossible to ignore. On the desk behind her, the second phone lay beside the cloned files, its screen dark, its presence no longer an interruption, but a cornerstone. The fate object had done its work. Now it was part of a structure. Simone turned away from the window and switched off the lights. In the darkness, the city continued its ordered movement. Somewhere, in Charleston, preparations for the gala were already underway. Invitations sent, speeches drafted, the choreography of power being rehearsed. They believed the story had resolved itself. They believed the variable had been removed. Simone lay down and allowed herself, for the first time since the harbor at dusk, a moment of stillness that was not analysis, not strategy. A stillness that came from knowing that disappearance had never meant absence. It meant choosing the point of return. And when she returned, it would not be as a question. It would be as record. In Simone's world, emotion was never the force that moved events forward. Structure was. Love had been a moment. Fear had been a reaction. But strategy was architecture. Chicago became a grid of deliberate choices. She woke at the same hour every morning, not because she needed routine, but because repetition erased traceable patterns. Coffee from a different cafe each day. Meetings scheduled through encrypted channels that dissolved after confirmation. Documents handled only on air-gapped devices that never touched a public network. This was no longer about survival. This was about admissibility. The first person she brought into the plan was not a lawyer. It was a witness. Her name was Elena Morales, a senior nurse from the private clinic in Charleston. Simone had found her not through personnel listings, which were sealed, but through a malpractice deposition from 2 years earlier, where Elena's testimony had revealed something far more valuable than medical detail. Integrity. They met in a public conservatory filled with winter light and tropical plants, the air warm enough to slow the breath. Simone did not begin with accusations. She began with a question. Have you ever been asked to sign something that didn't belong to the patient? Elena's stillness was answer enough. The story came in careful layers. A late-night administrative override. A document prepared before the patient had even arrived. The instruction to process it as a draft and not ask questions. I refused, Elena said quietly. They removed me from the case the next morning. Simone slid the cloned document across the table. Elena did not touch it, but her eyes moved to the signature, then to the authorization code in the corner. That's not him, she said. You're certain? Elena met Graham Alden once during a foundation visit, she replied. Men like that don't write like this. They press harder. This is someone trying to be him. Simone nodded. Witness, not rumor, not interpretation. Witness. The second element was time. Audit trails were not about proving that something happened. They were about proving when it could not have happened. Graham's public schedule, speeches, flights, interviews, had been meticulously documented by Alden Maritime's own media releases. Every minute of his visibility was an alibi against the timestamps on the document edits. Simone layered the two timelines together. On the left, Graham Alden, visible to the world. On the right, Kessler.B, accessing, modifying, transferring. Two parallel structures that never intersected. Absence as evidence. She worked through the nights with the same calm precision she had brought to dismantling financial empires. Not driven by anger, but by alignment. Each file was hashed and time-sealed. Each transfer logged. Each witness statement recorded with notarized authentication. Chain of custody was no longer a legal phrase. It was a spine. The third element was narrative control. In her career, Simone had seen corporations survive crimes that should have destroyed them, not because they were innocent, because they owned the timing of the revelation. So she removed that power. A copy of the evidence package was delivered to an investigative journalist known for refusing pre-publication suppression. Not sent, placed by hand through an intermediary who did not know Simone's name. A second package was secured with her attorney, sealed under a trigger clause that would release it automatically if any legal action was filed against her. A third was stored in a digital escrow system that required 3 independent confirmations to open. Redundancy was not paranoia. It was continuity. In the evenings, when the city softened and the river reflected its cold, luminous geometry, Simone allowed herself to step out of the structure and walk, not to think, to feel the distance between who she had been in Charleston and who she had become. The woman who had lain beside Graham and believed in unguarded connection had not disappeared. She had been integrated because the plan was not built on revenge. It was built on restoration, not of the relationship, of reality. She thought of him sometimes, not as the man on the stage at the gala, not as the name on the forged document, but as the figure standing in the morning light, turning toward her with that unfiltered expression she had trusted. In her mind, she placed him where he belonged in the structure. Not the enemy, not the savior, a variable whose knowledge had been managed. The final element of the plan was the room, a room where suppression could not function. The Harbor Heritage Gala, broadcast live. Board members present, donors, regulators, media, all witnesses not to a scandal, but to an audit. Because that was what this would be, not an emotional confrontation, an audit of truth. The phrase came to her one night as she sat at the desk, the city's light reduced to a thin, steady line beyond the glass. Audit is a weapon, not because it destroyed, because it revealed, because it forced systems to answer in their own language. She wrote it at the top of the master file, not as a slogan, as an instruction. The day she booked her flight back to Charleston, she did it under her own name. Visibility, when chosen, was power. Her attorney confirmed the legal thresholds. The journalist confirmed the broadcast schedule. Elena's affidavit arrived, signed, notarized, unalterable. Simone closed the final folder and sat in the quiet that followed completion. There was no triumph in it, only stillness. The kind that came when a structure stood on its own. Her hand moved, as it often did now, to her abdomen. A future, not an argument, a fact. Outside, the river moved with its patient, unbreakable current. In Charleston, the gala preparations were entering their final phase. Speeches rehearsed, lighting tested, narratives polished. They believed the stage belonged to them. They believed the story had already been written. Simone stood and turned off the desk lamp. In the darkness, the screen of the second phone remained black, its work complete. The weapon had never been the document. It had been the audit, and the audit was ready. Charleston did not recognize her when she returned. That was the first advantage. The city was dressed for celebration. Banners along the harbor, black cars arriving in measured intervals, the soft choreography of wealth moving through historic streets that had learned long ago how to host power without ever appearing impressed by it. Simone stepped out of the car and addressed the color of midnight glass. Not black. Black absorbed light. This held it. The fabric moved like water when she walked, structured but fluid, designed for a woman who did not need to be announced because her presence completed its own introduction. Her name was on the guest list, not as an addition, not as an exception, as a donor. Her firm had made the contribution 2 weeks earlier through a foundation account that had existed for years. Quiet, legitimate, unquestionable. Access, when properly constructed, never required permission. The Harbor Heritage Ballroom opened before her in a sweep of gold and crystal. Ceilings high enough to make every voice feel smaller. Tables arranged in perfect arcs around the central stage. Screens suspended like floating windows, already displaying the Alden maritime insignia, the language of legacy and impact and continuity. A room designed for narrative. Simone paused at the entrance only long enough to let the architecture settle into her perception. Exits, camera placements. The press corridor to the left, where journalists gathered with the careful neutrality of people who knew they were watching something that would later require interpretation. Board members near the front, regulatory figures placed just far enough back to appear impartial. Witnesses everywhere. The word did not carry tension. It carried inevitability. She moved into the room with the same calm she brought into courtrooms and negotiation chambers. The calm of a woman who had already completed the most difficult part before anyone else had begun. Conversations flowed around her in soft, curated tones. The language of philanthropy, of expansion, of ethical futures and sustainable partnerships. No one stopped her. Recognition came in fragments, a glance that lingered half a second longer than expected, a name remembered from a conference, a polite nod that acknowledged her without placing her. She did not search for Graham. That was no longer the axis. The stage was. On it, technicians made final adjustments to the microphones, testing sound levels that would carry every word to every screen. Broadcast. Not just to the room, to the world beyond it. Her attorney stood near the press corridor, speaking to a correspondent with the relaxed posture of someone attending a social event. They did not look at each other. Connection, in this phase, existed only through preparation. Simone accepted a glass of water from a passing server and moved toward the side of the ballroom where the windows opened onto the harbor. Night had fallen. The water outside reflected the lights from the room in broken, shifting lines, gold fractured into movement. For a moment, she allowed herself to stand there between two versions of Charleston, the night that had held her in illusion, and this one, where every surface was illuminated. You came back. Graham's voice did not startle her. She had known the exact moment he would see her. Systems always registered anomalies. She turned. He stood a few steps away, dressed in the formal precision of a man whose life had never allowed him to appear unprepared. But his eyes, those did not belong to the stage. They belonged to the memory of a quieter room, a different night, a version of himself that had not yet been filtered through legal structures and controlled access. "You're on the program," she said, her tone even. As always, the space between them held everything that had not been said for months. Not accusation, not explanation, recognition. His gaze moved, briefly, almost involuntarily, to the curve of her abdomen. Not yet public, not yet a declaration, but no longer something that could be dismissed as illusion. Shock did not appear on his face. He had been trained too well for that. What appeared was something rarer. A fracture in certainty. "I tried to reach you," he said. The sentence carried the weight of someone who had discovered, too late, that access had been denied not by distance, but by design. "I know," Simone replied. She did not offer more. This was not the conversation. The stage lights brightened. A signal. 5 minutes. People began to take their seats, the room shifting from movement to attention with the quiet efficiency of a system accustomed to being observed. Graham's name appeared on the central screen. CEO. Visionary. Architect of the future. The narrative, perfectly constructed. "Simone," he said, his voice lower now, stripped of its public resonance. "Whatever you think." "This isn't about what I think," she interrupted gently. And there was no hostility in it, only clarity. "It's about what can be seen." The sentence settled between them with the same calm inevitability that had guided every step of her return. Across the room, Blair Kessler stood near the front table, her posture flawless, her expression composed in the way of someone who believed all variables had been accounted for. Their eyes met. For the first time since the lounge, Blair did not smile, but something in her stillness sharpened. Recognition, not of Simone's presence, of the structure behind. The room darkened slightly as the opening video began. Images of ships, of ports, of communities transformed by Alden Maritime's initiatives. Legacy rendered in motion. Simone moved toward her seat, second row from the aisle, close enough to the stage to be visible, close enough to the press to be undeniable. Her phone remained in her hand, not as a device, but as a key. Around her, the room settled into collective attention. Hundreds of people, regulators, journalists, board members, donors, every category of power arranged in a single field of vision. A room full of witnesses. She sat, her posture effortless, her expression composed, her presence no longer an anomaly, but a fixed point in the architecture of the evening. On stage, Graham stepped into the light. Applause rose, controlled, elegant, rehearsed. He began to speak about integrity, about transparency, about the responsibility of leadership in a world that demanded accountability. The words moved through the room with the practiced ease of a narrative that had never been publicly challenged. Simone listened, not to the speech, to the structure, timing, pauses. The moment when the live broadcast shifted from introduction to open floor. Her hand rested lightly over the life inside her, not in protection, but in acknowledgement. Everything that had been hidden, everything that had been contained, everything that had been rewritten was now inside a system that could no longer suppress without exposing itself. Graham's voice carried across the ballroom, steady, assured. Behind him, the screens reflected his image back to the audience in multiplied clarity. Light. Everywhere, Simone lifted her gaze to the stage, to the cameras, to the rows of faces turned toward a single point of focus. If it ends in light. The line returned to her, not as a memory, but as the present tense. The room was ready, and for the first time since Charleston, she allowed herself to breathe not as an analyst, not as a strategist, but as a woman who had aligned every part of her life with a single, irreversible moment. A room full of witnesses, and the truth, no longer private, waiting for its turn to be spoken. The first thing the room noticed was not her face. It was the timing, not early enough to look eager, not late enough to appear disruptive. She moved during the transition between applause and the next segment, that precise, unclaimed interval when attention loosens and then reforms. Professionals understood timing the way musicians understood silence. Simone rose from her seat with the same calm she used when entering a boardroom where the outcome had already been decided in her favor. The midnight glass fabric of her dress caught the stage light and released it in controlled reflections. Not spectacle, not seduction, but presence. She did not look toward Graham. She did not look toward Blair. Her focus was the stage, the space where narratives were formalized and recorded. The moderator had just begun introducing the next portion of the program, a discussion on ethical expansion and governance transparency, when Simone reached the aisle. It was not a long walk, but it carried the quiet gravity of something inevitable. Heads turned in increments. First the journalists, trained to detect deviation. Then the board members, their instincts tuned to shifts in structure. Then the donors, whose attention followed the movement of power, even when they did not consciously register it. Simone walked as she always walked into professional spaces. Shoulders aligned, chin level, expression composed into the neutral clarity that made people lower their voices when she entered a room. Not because they feared her, because they recognized authority that did not require announcement. At the edge of the stage, she paused, not for effect, for protocol. The moderator looked down, momentarily uncertain, not about her identity, but about the script that did not include her. Simone inclined her head slightly, the gesture used between professionals who shared an understanding of procedure. "I'm Dr. Simone Hart," she said, her voice carrying with the exact modulation of someone accustomed to microphones in sworn testimony. "Forensic governance consultant. I believe I'm on the supplemental speaking list." She was not. but she spoke the sentence in the tone of a fact already verified. The moderator's earpiece buzzed. Across the room, three things happened at once. The press lifted their devices. Blair's hand stilled on the table. Graham stopped moving. Not visibly, but in the way a man stops breathing for half a second when the axis of his evening shifts. Simone did not look at him. This was not personal entry. This was professional positioning. The production assistant approached with the polite urgency of someone navigating unscripted variables. "Dr. Hart, we don't seem to." "Check the donor registry," Simone replied softly, handing over a slim card. The assistant did, and in the space of 10 seconds, the architecture of access realigned. Donor, contributor, hour later. The assistant stepped back. The moderator smiled, the public smile that covered every deviation in live events. "Of course," he said into the microphone, "we're honored to welcome Dr. Simone Hart, whose work in forensic compliance has influenced governance structures worldwide." Applause followed. Polite, curious, uninformed, Simone stepped onto the stage, not as a woman returning, as an expert invited into a conversation. The lights were brighter here. They erased shadow. From this height, she could see everything. The press row, phones already angled upward. The board, calculating. Regulators, attentive in the way of people trained to detect legal consequence. Blair, still as a sculpture, her composure now a study in containment. And Graham, standing a few feet away, the controlled narrative of his posture, interrupted by something far more human, recognition that did not belong to the program. Simone took her place beside the lectern without touching it. The moderator stepped aside, giving her the floor with the instinctive deference afforded to someone whose credentials had already been validated in the system. Her hands rested lightly at her sides, not gripping, not defensive, the posture of a witness delivering a report. "When we talk about transparency," she began, her voice steady and unforced, "we often speak about it as a principle, an aspiration, a value that organizations claim as part of their identity." The room settled, not into silence, into attention. Simone did not raise her volume. She lowered the pace. "For those of us who work in forensic governance," she continued, "transparency is not a value. It's a process, a sequence of verifiable actions that can withstand independent audit." Audit. The word moved through the room like a shift in pressure. Her gaze moved once across the audience. "Not searching, recording. This evening celebrates legacy," she said. "Impact. The structures that allow institutions to be trusted." She turned slightly toward the central screen, where Graham's image still lingered from the opening video. "Trust," she added, "is not built on narrative. It's built on access to truth." From the second row, her attorney rose and moved toward the press corridor. The first signal. Simone did not acknowledge it. She had entered as a professional. She would proceed as one. "I was asked recently," she said, "to sign a document that redefined a sequence of events in order to preserve institutional coherence. No names, no accusations, language, precise, legal, the kind that forced regulators to listen and journalists to record. And I declined," she finished. A pause. "Not dramatic, procedural. Because an audit is not an act of destruction," Simone said. "It is an act of alignment." From the corner of her vision, she saw Blair shift for the first time. Not panic, adjustment. Graham had not moved at all. His gaze remained on her with the intensity of someone watching two realities converge: the private memory and the public record. Simone stepped forward, one pace, into the full wash of light. The cameras adjusted automatically, tightening their focus. She had not entered as a lover, not as a victim, not as a question. She had entered as an expert, a woman whose authority existed independently of every relationship in the room. And in that authority, something else emerged. Not soft, not vulnerable, but unmistakably human. The quiet knowledge that everything she had been, the night in Charleston, the months of disappearance, the life growing inside her, had not weakened her professionalism. It had refined it. She placed her hand on the lectern then, not to steady herself, but to signal transition. The responsibility of governance, she said, is not to protect reputation. Her eyes lifted, meeting the room, the cameras, the system that had attempted to contain her. It is to protect reality. In the audience, the press had stopped pretending this was a supplemental speech. Regulators were taking notes. Board members were no longer performing attentiveness. They were calculating exposure. Simone stood in the center of the stage, not illuminated by the light, but aligned with it. She had entered like a professional, and the room, whether it understood it yet or not, had shifted from ceremony to record. There is always a moment in every system, in every collapse, when control attempts to reassert itself. It does not arrive as panic. It arrives as procedure. Simone saw it before anyone else in the room did. A shift at the technical table. A hand lifted to an earpiece. The subtle, rehearsed choreography of interruption. Blair had not moved from her seat, but power did not require movement. It required access. And access, in this room, flowed through channels she had designed long before Simone ever stepped onto the stage. The moderator's smile tightened. The stage manager appeared at the edge of the curtains with the neutral urgency of someone about to correct a deviation in the program. Simone did not stop speaking, because stopping would acknowledge the attempt, and the attempt, if acknowledged, would become authority. Alignment between record and action, she continued, her voice steady, her cadence unchanged. Because governance without verifiable sequence is not governance, it's theater. The word landed with quiet precision. Behind her, one of the suspended screens flickered. A brief, almost invisible interruption. Then the microphone gave a soft, hollow pulse. The sound of a channel being tested for silence. In the front row, Blair rose. Not abruptly, elegantly. The movement of a woman who understood optics better than anyone in the room. She crossed the space between tables with a smile that could have belonged to a patron offering a clarification, not an architect of containment. "Dr. Hart," Blair called, her voice warm enough to carry without amplification. "Perhaps we can continue this discussion in a more appropriate setting. The program is on a very specific schedule." The audience turned toward her, grateful for the familiarity of authority re-establishing order. Simone turned her head slightly. Not fully, just enough to acknowledge Blair as one professional acknowledging another. And in that half-turn, their two structures met in open light for the first time. Blair's eyes held the calm of someone who had never lost a room. Not once. The signal was given. The microphone cut. The sound died. For a fraction of a second, the ballroom returned to the acoustics of its architecture. High ceilings swallowing the edges of unamplified speech. The natural environment reclaiming the space from technology. It was the last point at which Simone could have been reduced to a private disruption instead of a public record. She did not reach for the microphone. She stepped away from it. One pace forward, into the open stage. Her voice, when she spoke again, was not louder. It was placed. Years of delivering testimony in rooms without amplification had taught her where sound lived, how to release it so it traveled cleanly, without strain. "Ms. Kessler is correct," Simone said, her tone composed, her words carrying with startling clarity into the first rows and then beyond. "Schedule matters." The technicians froze. Because the live broadcast, unlike the room's internal audio, had not lost its feed. The cameras were still transmitting every word, every movement, to an audience that could not be managed by proximity. Simone turned fully then, not toward Blair, but toward the press corridor. "The timing of disclosure," she continued, "is one of the primary mechanisms through which institutions protect themselves from accountability." On the far side of the room, her attorney handed a document to a journalist. Not dramatically, as if exchanging program notes. A second journalist received another. Blair saw it. The first fracture in her composure was not visible to most of the room. But Simone saw the recalculation, because this was no longer about a microphone. It was about containment failing across multiple channels at once. "Without independent witnesses," Simone said, still speaking into a room that now leaned toward her in a collective instinct to hear, "transparency becomes a private negotiation." The live screens behind her shift, not to her, to the default event branding. But in the press row, phones lifted higher, recording, streaming, multiplying her voice into digital space that could not be muted from the technical table. Blair stepped closer to the stage. "Simone," she said quietly, the warmth gone now, replaced by the first edge of steel. "You're compromising your own position." The use of her first name, a tactic, an attempt to relocate the moment from professional to personal. Simone met her gaze directly for the first time. "Governance is not a private position," she replied, and the sentence did what no volume ever could. It returned the conversation to structure, to process, to language that regulators and board members could not dismiss as emotional. The stage manager reached the steps, hesitating, because removing her physically would no longer look like program correction. It would look like suppression, and suppression in a room full of donors, regulators, and media was a record. Graham had not moved, but now he did. Not toward Simone, toward the technical table. One gesture, small, authoritative, the kind that had built empires. The internal audio returned. The microphone came back to life with a soft breath of sound. The room exhaled. Control, momentarily, seemed restored, but the axis had shifted because the attempt to silence had been seen. And once seen, it could not be rewritten as protocol. Simone stepped back to the lectern, not in victory, in continuation. "The integrity of an institution," she said into the restored amplification, "is measured not by how effectively it manages narrative, but by how it responds when that narrative is audited in public." Her voice now moved through every speaker, into every corner, into the live feed. Blair stood at the foot of the stage, perfectly composed again, but the room no longer read her the same way. Authority had been revealed as intervention, intervention as fear. Simone's hand rested lightly against the edge of the lectern, her posture unchanged, her expression calm. Inside her, the life she carried shifted. A small, grounding movement that aligned her body with the present moment. The last almost had passed. The point at which this could have been reduced to a private conversation in a closed office. Now it existed only as record. A visible attempt to cut sound. A visible failure. A room full of witnesses who had seen both. Simone lifted her gaze, not to Blair, not to Graham, but to the cameras, to the system that had once excluded her and now carried her voice beyond the reach of any internal control. "This," she said softly, "is why audit requires light." And in the stillness that followed, the structure that had protected itself through silence stood exposed. Not destroyed, not humiliated, but unable, for the first time, to return to the illusion that nothing had happened. The last almost was over. Only truth remained in motion. Silence, when it follows an exposed interruption, is never empty. It is recalibration. The ballroom held that silence now, not fragile, not confused, but sharpened by the collective awareness that something irreversible had already begun. Simone did not rush to fill it. She had spent her entire career understanding that the power of evidence did not lie in its volume, but in its sequence. When she spoke again, her voice carried none of the strain of confrontation. It carried the clarity of submission, not emotional, but procedural. "In forensic governance," she said, "disclosure is not an act of retaliation. A beat. It is the formal correction of a public record." Behind her, the screens shifted, not to a dramatic reveal, to a document, clean, white, numbered, a header that read, "Clinical authorization, executive access, no name, not yet." The audience leaned forward with the instinctive recognition of structure. This was no longer speech. This was audit. This document, Simone continued, was entered into a private medical system with a signature attributed to an individual whose verified schedule places him in 3 separate cities at the time of its creation. On the lower corner of the screen, a timeline appeared. Left side, Graham Alden's public engagements. Boston, 9:10 a.m. New York, 1:40 p.m. Live interview, 6 p.m. Right side, system access logs. Charleston, 12:03 p.m. 12:17 p.m. 12:42 p.m. Two columns, parallel, never intersecting. No accusation was spoken. None was required. In audit, Simone said, absence is as evidentiary as presence. The next screen, meta, user authorization. Kessler B. For the first time, a visible shift moved through the room. Not chaos, recognition. Board members turned almost involuntarily toward where Blair stood. Regulators stopped writing and began reading. The press no longer held their devices at chest level. They lifted them higher. This was no longer an event. This was record. Simone did not look at Blair, because this was not about a person. This access point, she continued, initiated a document designed to establish executive consent in a matter where no such consent had been given. Her tone never hardened. It remained precise, measured. The language of sworn testimony. The purpose of that document, she said, was to alter a sequence of fact in order to preserve institutional narrative. The word narrative moved through the room like a reflection breaking. Not shattered, reconfigured. Simone stepped away from the lectern and moved toward the screen, her presence aligning with the projection so that the document and the woman who introduced it occupied the same plane of light. In private, she said, I was offered a contractual resolution. The next image appeared. A clause, highlight. The undersigned agrees to refrain from any disclosure that may affect executive legacy. No names, only structure. A future, Simone added, in exchange for silence. The sentence did not sound wounded. It sounded evaluated, and I declined. In the second row, her attorney handed a sealed envelope to a regulatory official. Chain of custody now visible. Because the function of governance, Simone said, turning back to the audience, is not to protect power from truth. She paused. Not for effect, for alignment. It is to ensure that truth remains accessible to power. The room understood the distinction. This was not a personal revelation. It was a systemic failure. The next screen, an affidavit. Elena Morales, witness. Statement of removal from case following refusal to process unauthorized authorization. Not rumor, not interpretation. Witness. In every institution, Simone continued, there is a moment when private management of reality becomes incompatible with public responsibility. Her gaze moved once, and this time it found Graham. Not as a plea, not as an accusation, as a point in the structure. You were not the author of this document, she said. Not softly, not loudly, simply as fact. The sentence did not fracture the room. It reoriented it. Because in removing him from the act, she removed the last possible refuge of personal scandal. This was not betrayal between individuals. This was manipulation within a system. And for the first time, Graham's public composure gave way to something unmediated. Not denial, not defense, but the raw, disorienting recognition of having been positioned inside a narrative he had not written. Simone returned her gaze to the room. This is not revenge, she said. The words landed with the calm inevitability of a conclusion reached after exhaustive review. Revenge was emotional, private, imprecise. This is record. The final screen appeared, a sealed evidence chain, time-stamped, filed with independent review, released to investigative media under protected disclosure. Not threat. Completion. The architecture of containment had no remaining function, because suppression at this point would require public contradiction of verifiable sequence. And that was no longer governance. That was obstruction. Simone stood in the center of the stage, the light holding her in clear definition. Her hand moved, almost unconsciously, to rest against the life she carried. Not as revelation, not as performance, but as the quiet physical truth that had been the origin of every attempt to rewrite the narrative. I stand here, she said, not as a claimant, not as an adversary, but as a forensic consultant fulfilling the only obligation that role requires. Her voice softened then, not in weakness, but in something deeper. The human layer beneath the professional one. Reality, she finished, must remain accessible. The room did not erupt. It did not collapse. It entered the stillness of processing, because what had been presented could not be argued with volume or position. It existed in the language of governance, in the framework of law, in the visible sequence of fact. Blair had not moved, but her stillness no longer read as control. It read as containment without access. Graham stood in the light of his own image on the screen behind him, the narrative of his speech replaced by the architecture of the truth that now defined the evening. Simone stepped back from the center, not in retreat, in completion. The disclosure had not been a moment of exposure. It had been a restoration. The record, corrected in the only place it could no longer be altered, in light. And in that light, the difference between power and integrity became visible to everyone in the room, not as an idea, but as a documented fact. The downfall did not begin with screaming. It began with silence that had weight. The kind of silence that settles into a room after evidence is displayed and no one can pretend they didn't see it. Blair Kessler stood at the foot of the stage, posture flawless, hands relaxed at her sides, as if she were waiting for the program to return to its schedule. But the room had moved past schedule. The room had entered record. And once record exists, access becomes the only currency that matters. The first step happened before the applause even decided whether it belonged. A regulatory official rose from his seat and walked, not toward Simone, but toward the technical table. He didn't speak loudly. He didn't need to. He showed a badge to the head of production and asked calmly for a copy of the live feed and the system logs associated with the audio interruption. The technician nodded automatically, as if compliance had been wired into his hands. Blair's eyes flickered toward the table. She understood this language. Witness preservation meant the narrative was no longer internal. Step 1, control of the room leaves her. Then the board moved, not with drama, with instinct. A woman on the audit committee, silver hair, neutral expression, leaned toward the chairman and murmured something that looked like a question but sounded, in Blair's posture, like a command. The chairman stood. He did not look at Blair. He looked at Graham. CEO Alden, he said into the microphone, voice careful. We need a brief recess, not for the audience, for the board. Step 2, decision-making relocates. The stage lights dimmed slightly as event staff scrambled, trying to reassemble the evening into something recognizable. But the gala was no longer a ceremony. It was a live governance event. Simone watched it unfold without shifting. She had built this chain with the calmness of a woman who knew that accountability didn't need force. It needed sequence. Blair took one step toward Graham, as if muscle memory could restore proximity, as if she could slide back into the space where she had always stood, one beat ahead of his decisions. Graham's gaze met hers, and for the first time, he did not look past her like she was part of his operating system. He looked at her like she was a variable he was finally seeing. I didn't authorize that, he said quietly. His voice wasn't loud enough for the room, but it didn't need to be. It was for her. For the first time, the man she had managed spoke to her as if she were not the gatekeeper, but the one standing on the wrong side of the gate. Blair's smile didn't move. Of course you didn't, she replied softly. That's why I handled it. The words were almost tender in their control, as if erasing someone else's life was a task on a checklist. Graham's jaw tightened, and then he did something small that changed everything. He lifted his phone, looked at his chief of security, an older man in a black suit who had been watching the room like it was a battlefield. One nod. Step 3, physical access is reassigned. Security moved, not toward Simone, but toward Blair. 2 men appeared at her flank with polite firmness. Ms. Kessler, one said, voice low, we need you to come with us. Blair's head tilted, a gesture she used when she wanted to make someone feel foolish for misunderstanding her authority. I'm the executive office, she said, not a boast. A reminder. The guard didn't flinch, not tonight. Those 2 words were the first real crack in the illusion. Blair didn't resist. She didn't need to. She believed, still, that this was temporary, that her access would be restored, because in her mind, access was not granted. It was inherent. But as she walked past the board table, the chairman stepped aside, not for her, but away from her. Step 4, Social access collapses. Donors stop meeting her eyes. The columnist who had once laughed at her jokes now stared down at his phone as if she had become inconvenient to acknowledge. The room did not hate Blair. Hate would have given her significance. The room and risk, once publicly documented, is contagious. In a side corridor, away from cameras, but still within hearing distance of press, Blair's phone buzzed. Once, twice, then a sequence of notifications that arrived too quickly to be anything but automated. Access revoked. Executive calendar. Access revoked. Finance approvals. Access suspended. Medical partnership portal credentials. Disabled. Corporate network. She stared at the screen. Her face remained composed, but her fingers tightened around the phone as if she could squeeze the system into obeying her. She looked at Graham as if waiting for him to correct it. He didn't. He turned away from her and toward the board. Step 5. Digital access disappears. The audit committee chair spoke to him with controlled urgency, and Graham listened, really listened, in a way that told Blair the truth before any official statement could. He was taking direction around her. Blair's breath remained steady, but the steadiness began to feel like a costume because she had built her entire identity on the idea that she was essential. Yet now, things were moving faster than they ever had. Without her, outside, near the loading entrance, a black SUV waited, not for donors, not for press. For containment, a compliance officer from the hospital network arrived with a folder and a face drained of color. He spoke in urgent whispers to the regulator, then to the board's legal counsel. The hospital partnership Blair had overseen was now a liability. The clinic's records would be audited, administrative overrides reviewed, every access code traced. And once traced, nothing would remain procedural. It would become criminal. Step 6. Institutional allies detach. Blair watched the compliance officer avoid her gaze, watched him move past her like she was already a past tense. The security guard extended his hand. Your badge. Blair blinked once, slowly, as if the request was absurd. Then she reached into her clutch and pulled out the slim executive credential card she had worn like a second skin for years. She placed it in his palm. Not tossed, not surrendered, placed. Her mouth curved into the smallest smile. You think this ends me, she said softly. The guard didn't respond. He didn't need to. The system already had. Step 7. Symbolic access is removed. Inside the ballroom, the live feed continued. Journalists spoke in hushed bursts into microphones. Regulators began drafting immediate preservation orders. Board members convened in an emergency session. And on stage, Simone's calm presence remained like a fixed point of light, an unmovable contrast to the woman whose power had always depended on shadows. Blair's phone buzzed again. A final notification. Termination initiated. Chief of Staff role. Pending board vote. She stared at it as if language itself had betrayed her. Because it wasn't a threat. It was an automated outcome, a system correcting itself under witness pressure. Blair turned her gaze back toward the ballroom doors, toward the stage, toward the life she had tried to erase with a document and a signature that wasn't his. And for the first time, something raw crossed her eyes. Not fear, not regret, disbelief, because she had believed she could manage reality, that she could edit it, that she could decide what belonged in light and what would remain private. But in a room full of witnesses, the rules were different. Witnesses don't negotiate. They record, and record does not need permission. As security escorted her toward the exit, Blair's heels clicked against the marble. Sharp, controlled, still elegant. But each step carried a new meaning. Not authority, distance, removal. The last glimpse the room caught of her was not a villain dragged away, not a dramatic collapse. It was a woman who had lost the only thing that ever made her powerful. Access, revoked, step by step, until all that remained was the truth she had tried to silence. Still speaking, still documented, still alive in the light. The ballroom did not return to what it had been. Events like that never do. Once truth has been entered into a system under witness, the room remembers it even after the lights are lowered, the tables cleared, the orchestra dismissed. But Simone did not stay to watch the aftermath. Power, she had learned, did not linger for applause. It concluded its work and chose its next position. She stepped off the stage at the exact moment the board moved into closed session, and the press corridor erupted into the controlled chaos of breaking language. Her name was already being spoken, carefully, precisely, by journalists who understood that this was no longer a personal story, but a governance event. Dr. Simone Hart, forensic consultant, primary source, record. She walked through the ballroom as she had entered it, aligned, unhurried, her presence neither seeking attention nor avoiding it. People moved aside instinctively, not because she demanded space, but because the axis of the evening had shifted around her. Near the exit, Graham caught up with her, not running, not calling her name across the room. He approached the way a man approaches a truth he can no longer delegate. Simone, she stopped, turned. The distance between them was no longer filled with illusion, only clarity. For the first time since Charleston, they stood without a system between them. I didn't know, he said. It was not a defense. It was an admission of structure, of how completely his life had been filtered through access he no longer controlled. I know, she replied, and she did. That was the difference between accusation and audit. He looked at her, not at the evidence, not at the room behind her, but at her, at the woman who had walked into a controlled environment and rewritten its terms without raising her voice. You could have come to me, he said. The old sentence. The private solution, the language of a world where problems were resolved behind closed doors. Simone's expression softened, not with surrender, but with recognition of what they had once been. If I had, she said gently, it would still be private. The night air outside the ballroom carried the scent of the harbor, the same water that had witnessed the beginning of their story, now holding the reflection of something entirely different. He followed her out. No cameras, no board. No blare, just the sound of distant waves against the marina and the hum of a city that would wake tomorrow to a corrected record. What happens now? He asked, not as a CEO, as a man standing in a moment he did not control. Simone turned toward him, fully. For the first time, she placed his future inside a structure that was not built by him. I don't disappear, she said, not a threat, a condition. I don't become a private settlement, a quiet clause, or a narrative adjusted for comfort. Her hand rested over the life she carried, not as a revelation, not as leverage, but as fact. This, she continued, is not a secret, and it's not an inheritance, it's a responsibility. The harbor lights moved in the water behind her, fractured gold becoming a steady line. If you want access, she said, her voice calm and unyielding, it happens in the same place everything else does, in the light. No asking, no waiting, terms, clear, professional, human. He nodded slowly, not in agreement yet, but in understanding. Because for the first time in his life, access to something that mattered could not be granted by position, by power, or by a signature. It had to be earned in sequence. Simone stepped back, not away from him, forward into her own trajectory. In the weeks that followed, the language around her changed. Not scandal, not controversy, reform, independent oversight, new governance standards drafted using the framework she had forced into visibility. Her firm's name appeared in policy briefings. Universities requested her lectures on institutional transparency. Regulatory boards cited her case as a structural precedent. She did not become famous. She became foundational. And one morning, months later, in a building made entirely of glass on the edge of the Potomac, her name appeared alone on a brushed steel plaque. Simone Hart, Forensic Governance Architecture. No hyphen, no shared legacy. No history that required explanation. Inside, sunlight moved across the floor in long, clean lines. Her daughter slept in the adjoining room, visible through a transparent wall that had no curtains. Nothing to hide, nothing to protect through secrecy. Everything built in light. Simone stood at the window, the city unfolding in ordered structure beneath her, and for the first time since Charleston, The future did not feel like a negotiation. It felt like design. She had not won a man. She had not destroyed a woman. She had rewritten a system. And she had done it without asking for permission, only setting terms. If this story stayed with you, if you believe in women who don't beg for truth, but build lives where truth is the foundation, then let it live beyond this moment. Carry it into your own standards. Share it with someone who needs to remember their power. And stay here for the next story, because the women who step into the light are just getting started.